Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to the taxi tutorial in the iniBuilds Airbus A350. Let's go right inside and start setting our aircraft up for today's taxi to runway 35 left here in Istanbul. Now, before we get going, we gotta ask ourselves one question. How busy is the taxi going to be? Do we have long straight lines where we can conduct the flight control check? Or do we have to conduct the flight control check while standing? As a default option, I would recommend to do it while you're standing, but you can do it during taxi in order to save some time and some fuel. So let's do it standing. And the flight control check is done as follows. When you move the controls, the flight control page is automatically going to show on the eCam, and we are going to check the full travel of the flight control surfaces, make slow but deliberate inputs, and basically we are going to verify that the flight controls are going to move to the full extent. So we start going up, so pull the stick all the way up and you can check the elevators moving all the way up over here. Give it a little while to stay in that position so that the system can detect any possible fault that you might have in the actual flight controls. Then we're going to go full down and back to neutral. Now we go full left. We check that our ailerons move, and the spoilers move as well. Then we go full right and back to neutral. Last, we press the pedal disconnect button on the tiller, and now we can check the rudder without scrubbing the nose wheel over the ground. So we go full left, and then we go full right, and back to neutral. Be sure to do this test slowly, because chances are that you might cause a little bit of noise at the in the region of the rudder, which might be a little bit worrisome for your passengers. When the check is complete, release the pedal disconnect button once again. And now we are ready to start taxiing, so let's go for it. We check that we are clear on the left side and that we are clear on the right side. Remember, you have a huge wingspan on the A350, you gotta keep that in mind. But no guys, it's probably not as big as you think. So, when we're ready to roll and have received taxi clearance, we're going to switch the nose light into the taxi position, and there are no more runway turn-off lights on the A350, they're integrated with the nose lights. So, just the nose light to taxi, that's all you need. Then we can release our park and brake, and when the aircraft starts moving, which it will do on idle thrust if you're at very light weights, and many flight simmers are probably going to be at light weights when they operate the aircraft, then it does start to roll on its own. If you're at typical weights for the typical long-haul flight, then you will need a little bit of thrust to get the aircraft moving, but use no more than 30% N1. If more is needed, the upper limit is 40%, and that can only be used if you know that the area behind is clear. Next, we're going to conduct the brake check. For that, we check the brake pressure indicator down here, and on the A350 we actually do get a brake pressure. So do the check, see that some pressure is coming, and then you can already release those brakes again. And that's the brake check completed. Now, I do recommend, if you have a Navigraph subscription, use the en route chart and zoom it all the way in, that way you get a live taxi chart. And you of course also have the ANF available on your nav display as well. Unfortunately, at this point the taxi camera is not modeled, otherwise if that gets added at a later point, I absolutely recommend that you use that as well. Now, no more than 10 knots for any turn greater than 30 degrees. So we really got to keep the airplane slow over here. We have to use an oversteering technique, and if you come from the A330 or if you have flown the A321, then you might be surprised how much of an oversteering you actually need, because the nose wheel is located quite a bit further forward on the aircraft than it is on your favorite Airbus A330. So quite a lot of oversteering is actually needed to get your A350 moving. Now, the A350 is equipped with carbon brakes, and carbon brakes wear down depending on the number of applications, not on the applied pressure or the duration of the braking. The only point that matter there is the number of brake applications and of course the brake temperature. Now, the brake temperature is going to rise with each brake application, and also depending on the amount of braking you apply. So if you just use very light braking all the time, and if you let those brakes skid, then they are going to heat up fairly quickly. You need to keep the brake temperature below 300 degrees, and if you intend to use the brake fan, you got to keep it below 150 degrees for a takeoff to be permissible. If you're at a light weight and the aircraft starts accelerating on its own, like ours does over here, let it accelerate all the way up to 30 knots, and then smoothly and gradually brake it back down towards 10 knots. So I'm going to initiate a smooth braking action over here, intending to bring it back down to 10 knots by the time we got to make the left-hand turn towards our runway threshold over here. So that's the proper technique. If on the other hand side you are at a very high gross weight, then you will actually have to use some thrust to get the aircraft moving, as mentioned before. Up to 30% can be used without any worries, between 30 and 40 only if you know that the area behind you is clear, since otherwise you're just generating too much thrust. You gotta get used to how the oversteering on the aircraft feels. What I do is to imagine the point around which I'm turning behind my aircraft, and I kinda steer that imaginary point across the center line, and that usually makes oversteering quite an acceptable manner when taxiing our aircraft. But it needs a little bit of getting used to. A small point here, especially when you're new to the plane, just go to the outside every now and then to check that you're actually driving on the center line, and always remember you're sitting almost in the middle of the plane, so basically if the center line goes through your right leg, then you are pretty much safe that you are actually riding on the center line. So very much recommended to keep that in mind. You also have a little hint over here with that little screw up here on the glare shield. If that is located on the center line, then basically you are driving on the center line as well. So we are going to cross a runway here. Since we have calculated the intersection departure, we do intend to use that. So if we are about to cross an active runway, then turn the strobe light on before entering that runway. Something you might notice if you look at the tillers down there is that I do smooth but steady inputs. If you constantly go left and right with your tiller, it's going to feel very uncomfortable for your passengers. So always use smooth and deliberate inputs like this. See, I want to go to the right, I do my input and I hold it there. Like that. And that's how you control your aircraft properly, how you keep everything under nice controls. Now, when you do that right, taxiing the A350 is really a joy. It rolls really nicely, and there is really not much more to say about that. Well, I am just going to stop the aircraft over here at the holding point, and when you do that, be sure that you roll far enough forward towards the actual holding point. When you come to a stop, set the parking brake and turn the taxi light or the nose light off. Also, when you have vacated a runway, be sure to turn the strobe light back into the auto position so that you don't stand at a threshold with the strobes shining. And just as a small reminder, yes, I know holding at this position right here, we are basically on the other runway, so the strobes should remain on. No need to mention that. I'm talking general principle here of how to operate the lights. Well, and this is how you taxi your A350. Now, one small word here on taxi technique. That's if you need to do a 180-degree turn on a runway, or a taxiway for that matter, then it is recommended that you drive the aircraft on the opposite side of your seat on the runway. So I'm sitting on the left side, so it is recommended that you would then taxi on the right side of the runway. Maintain a ground speed of at least 5 knots when making a larger turn, since otherwise you risk stopping the aircraft during taxi. Then turn towards the center line, maintaining a 20-degree divergence from the runway exit, And as you're approaching the runway edge, once you sit physically above the edge of the runway, then you use up to full tiller deflection around the other side, and if necessary you can use asymmetric thrust, so add thrust on the outboard engine during the turn as well in order to keep the speed. Differential braking can also be used on the inboard brake of the turn in question. When the turn is complete, align with the runway center line and release the tiller to neutral before stopping the aircraft. And that's how you do a 180-degree turn on the runway. Now, when we are nicely taxiing along a long straight line, then we are eventually going to do our taxi flow. And for that, the pilot monitoring would once again cross-check our departure runway, SID, performance data, and a correct FCU setup. Now that's rather hard to do in a flight simulator, I do agree with that, and we have checked it a couple times earlier on, but just for the sake of completeness, I'm mentioning that over here. Now, from there on, we can also check our ADIRS alignment. So during taxi, a good way to check the global consistency of the FMS entry, so your position, flight plan, etc., is to check the position of the runway, the SID on the ND, in comparison to the aircraft symbol. So down here we can see we are showing slightly to the right of the taxiway, so that's probably a little bit of a misalignment of our IRS over here, but you know, that's 10 meters. That is irrelevant, doesn't matter. Now, you can just go to the 10-mile range over here and you would see any gross errors that you may have during your taxi. Now, with all of that done, we go into the taxi flow, and the taxi flow is going to be the following. So the pilot monitoring is going to execute this, and you are going to turn the auto brake on, which always arms it in RTO mode, by the way. So single button for all auto brake modes. So auto brake on, then you move down, you check that the correct squawk is set, and then you press and hold the takeoff config push button on the ECAN control panel. And you can see up here on the ECAN that that's going to turn the takeoff config normal. And with that, we have completed the taxi flow. When that is done, we are going to call for the before takeoff checklist down to the line. And we find that down here in the checklist menu. And that's going to go flight controls, checked. So we verify that the check has been done. We don't do the check now. Flight instruments, checked. Briefing, confirmed. V1, VRB2 thrust rating. And for this, we once again confirm our takeoff ratings. And my recommendation is to get this right from the display. So you can see V1 140, VR 142, gotta know that one in mind, V2 147, and Flex 69. And last we have the squawk, which is set. And that's the before takeoff checklist complete down to the line. You can see that the entire ECAN memo also shows down here and is completely automatically sensed. Alright, and that completes the before takeoff checklist down to the line. And that shall complete our taxi tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this one interesting. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments underneath the video. If you've got any questions, you can ask them down there as well. And with that, I'm really looking forward to see you all again on the takeoff tutorial up next. Thank you very much, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.